Welcome to Mr. Phantom, where fear hides in every shadow and chilling tales come to life. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like this video to get a scary story every night. Tonight, let your mind unwind. Take a deep breath in and slowly exhale. The world around you begins to dim. The sounds fade away, leaving only a comforting silence. In moments like this, between wakefulness and dreams, old stories tend to surface. Stories that whisper in your ear, slipping into your thoughts, leading you to a place where the line between reality and something deeper begins to blur. Imagine a small town, quiet at night, with only the dim glow of streetlights and the distant ticking of a clock. You've just moved into a modest apartment, nothing unusual, or so you thought. But across the hall, inside the room of an old neighbor, there is a clock that ticks backward. Not broken, not a coincidence. And every time its hands reach zero, someone in the neighborhood never wakes up again. Are you ready to hear the story? Close your eyes. Let this voice guide you into a world where time moves in the wrong direction, and every second brings us closer to something we cannot escape. Welcome to tonight's story. The clock that ticks backward. Moving into a new apartment always carried a mix of excitement and anxiety. I had lived in big cities before, but this place, an aging apartment complex in a quiet town in America, felt different. It wasn't run down, but it had a certain weight to it, as if the walls had absorbed years of whispered secrets and restless nights. The hallways stretched long and narrow, their dim yellow lighting casting elongated shadows that flickered when someone walked past. The building itself wasn't too old, maybe from the 60s, but it creaked like it had been standing for centuries. My unit was on the third floor, right at the end of the hallway. The windows faced a street that was always eerily quiet at night, despite the fact that there were plenty of residents in the building. The landlord had given me a quick tour, mentioning the usual: fire exits, laundry room, mailboxes. But one thing he didn't talk about was my neighbor across the hall. I didn't think much of it at first. Some people preferred their privacy, and I had no reason to intrude. But then I saw him. It was my second night in the apartment. I had just finished unpacking the last of my boxes and was about to collapse onto my bed when I heard a faint ticking sound. Not a normal, rhythmic tick-tock of an ordinary clock, but something off. The beats weren't consistent. Some were too fast, others too slow. It sounded like a clock trying to keep up with time, but failing miserably. Curious, I stepped into the hallway and looked around. That's when I noticed the door directly across from mine, apartment 309, was slightly ajar. A sliver of darkness peeked through the gap, but what caught my attention was the faint glow of something inside. I squinted, trying to see more clearly, when suddenly, the door creaked open just an inch more. And he was there. A man, possibly in his late 60s, stood just beyond the threshold. His skin was sallow, stretched too tightly over his sharp cheekbones. His eyes, deep, hollow, and sunken, bore into me as if he had been expecting me to look. He didn't move, didn't blink. Just stood there, framed by the dim light of his apartment, his figure eerily still. I froze. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I felt like I was intruding on something I wasn't supposed to see, but before I could say anything, he moved. Not his whole body, just his hand, raising ever so slightly. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he pressed his fingers against the door and pushed it closed. Click. The lock engaged, and I was left standing there, heart hammering in my chest. I backed away, returning to my apartment, but the image of his hollow stare stayed with me. Who was he? Why had he been standing there like that? And why did his apartment feel wrong? Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his gaunt face in my mind. The way his fingers pressed against the door, as if he were locking something inside, something he was afraid might escape. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just an old man with poor social skills. Maybe he was just surprised to see a new neighbor. Either way, I convinced myself not to dwell on it. Days passed, and I didn't see him again. But I heard the ticking. Every night. It would start faint, barely audible, like a whisper at the edge of my perception. Then it would grow louder, filling the quiet void of my apartment with its strange, irregular rhythm. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to pinpoint the source, and that's when I realized it was coming from his apartment, from apartment 309. I told myself not to investigate. It wasn't my business, but the ticking never stopped. It got under my skin, gnawed at my nerves. I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, counting the erratic beats as they slowed down, sped up, then slowed again. And then one night, my curiosity got the better of me. I crept out into the hallway, making sure the coast was clear. I stood in front of his door, pressing my ear against the wood. The ticking was louder now, as if I had gotten closer to its heart. And then I saw it, through the tiny gap at the bottom of the door, a faint glow. That same eerie glow I had seen on my first night. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I knew I shouldn't. I knew that if I pushed that door open, I might see something I wouldn't be able to forget. But before I could make a decision, a voice, low and rasping, spoke from the other side. "You shouldn't be here." I yelped, stumbling backward as the door creaked open just slightly, just enough for me to see him again. Mr. Grayson. His face was pale, even paler than before, his skin stretched impossibly thin. His eyes, those dark, empty hollows, seemed even deeper now, as if he hadn't slept in decades. He looked at me, but this time there was something else in his expression. Not anger, not annoyance, fear. He opened his mouth, as if to say something more, but then he stopped. His eyes flicked toward something inside the apartment. I followed his gaze, but the room was too dark to make anything out. Then he did something that sent a chill straight down my spine. He reached out, slowly, shakily, and pulled the door shut. But right before it closed completely, I caught a glimpse of it. A clock, sitting on the wall behind him, its hands moving in reverse. The second hand stuttered, jerking backward in uneven beats. The glow I had seen before came from it, an eerie, pulsating light that seemed almost alive. The lock clicked into place, and the hallway fell into silence once more. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. A clock running backward? Why? I backed away, my mind racing with questions. What the hell was happening in apartment 309? Who was Mr. Grayson really? And why did he look at that clock like it was something to be feared? That night, the ticking didn't just keep me awake. It made me afraid to sleep. I shouldn't have looked. I knew that the moment my eyes landed on that cursed clock. It was around midnight when I heard the ticking again. Faint but persistent, seeping through the walls like an unwelcome whisper. It had been days since my strange encounter with Mr. Grayson, and I still couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was terribly wrong with him. Or rather, with his apartment. That damn clock. I told myself it was just an old, broken timepiece. Maybe the gears inside were misaligned, causing it to run backward. Maybe Mr. Grayson had some strange obsession with antiques. Maybe I was overthinking everything. But deep down, I knew better. Curiosity got the best of me. I crept toward my window, which faced Mr. Grayson's apartment. His curtains were mostly drawn, but there was a slight gap, just enough for me to see inside. At first, it was just shadows. The dim glow of a street lamp flickered against the walls, casting distorted figures across the room. Then I saw it. The clock. Mounted on the wall, its face bathed in an unnatural glow. The hands twitched and jerked backward with each uneven tick. It wasn't moving at a steady pace. Instead, it struggled, like something inside was resisting time itself. And then, my breath caught in my throat. The second hand was nearing zero. I didn't know why, but dread filled my chest as I watched. The closer it got, the heavier the air around me felt. The ticking grew louder, drilling into my skull. I could feel my heartbeat sinking with it, an uncomfortable rhythm that made my skin crawl. Tick, tick, tick. Then, the hand struck zero. At that exact moment, a scream tore through the night. I jumped back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The scream had come from the building next door. A chill ran down my spine as I rushed to the window, scanning for the source of the sound. A light flickered on in one of the neighboring apartments. People were gathering in the hallway outside a door, their voices panicked, overlapping. Then, someone shouted the words that sent ice through my veins. "He's dead." I couldn't breathe. I didn't know who had died, but I knew that the clock had something to do with it. I forced myself to move, scrambling toward my front door. I needed to know for sure. My legs felt weak as I stumbled into the hallway, heart hammering. I reached the neighboring building's entrance just as an ambulance pulled up, its flashing lights painting the walls in harsh reds and blues. The paramedics rushed inside, and a few moments later, they came back out, carrying a body on a stretcher. A man, middle-aged, lifeless. I recognized him. I had seen him before, walking his dog in the mornings. We had exchanged small talk once or twice. I didn't even know his name. And now he was dead. The people around me murmured in hushed tones. "Heart attack," someone said. "Happened out of nowhere." But I knew it wasn't out of nowhere. I turned, my gaze snapping back toward Mr. Grayson's apartment. The curtains were fully shut now, concealing whatever lay inside. But I could still hear it. The ticking. It was softer now, almost satisfied, like the clock had claimed what it was waiting for. I backed away, my entire body trembling. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. The clock had reached zero, and someone had died. I barely made it back to my apartment before my legs gave out. I collapsed onto my couch, gripping my head, trying to process what I had just witnessed. No, it didn't make sense. A clock predicting death? It was insane. It defied all logic. And yet, I had seen it happen with my own eyes. What if it wasn't just predicting? What if it was causing it? The thought made my stomach churn. I had to find out the truth. The next morning, I was determined to confront Mr. Grayson. I waited until I saw him leave his apartment, his frail figure shuffling toward the lobby. This was my chance. I took a deep breath and walked to his door. Knocked once. No answer. Knocked again, harder. Nothing. A cold sweat prickled at my skin. I wasn't sure what I expected, but the silence felt wrong. I looked around the hallway, making sure no one was watching, then hesitantly reached for the doorknob. Locked. I shouldn't have been surprised, but something inside me refused to give up. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. Tick, tick, tick. It was louder now, as if it knew I was there. A sense of dread pooled in my stomach. I turned away, gripping my arms, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I stepped back into my own apartment, my phone buzzed. A news notification. Local resident suffers sudden heart attack. No prior health issues reported. I swallowed hard. It confirmed what I already knew. The clock wasn't just a broken antique. It was counting down to death. And if that was true, who would be next? I couldn't ignore it anymore. The clock was not just a creepy old relic. It was something far worse. Something unnatural. Something deadly. After what I had witnessed last night, I barely slept. The image of the clock's hands ticking backward, then striking zero at the exact moment of the man's death, haunted me. It felt like my brain was fighting itself, trying to force a rational explanation where none existed. But deep down, I already knew the truth. That clock predicted death. Or maybe it caused it. By the time morning arrived, my mind was set. I needed answers. I decided to start with the apartment's history. Most old buildings had stories. Murders, suicides, disappearances. And if that clock had been here for a long time, there had to be something tied to it. I spent the afternoon searching online, digging through old records, forums, even archived newspapers from the town's library website. At first, I found nothing. Just the usual complaints about rent increases and minor disputes between tenants. But then, after hours of searching, I found something strange. Over the past 3 decades, there had been an unusually high number of sudden deaths in this apartment complex. Heart attacks, freak accidents, unexplained medical episodes. At first glance, they didn't seem connected. Different causes, different people. But as I traced the pattern, a chill ran down my spine. Each incident had occurred in or near my hallway. The deaths weren't spread evenly throughout the building. No, almost every single one of them was linked to an apartment on my floor. And worse, the intervals between deaths were eerily consistent. Roughly every few years, someone would die suddenly. No warnings. No obvious reasons. Just like last night. Just like the way the clock had counted down. I felt sick. Had anyone else noticed this? Was Mr. Grayson aware? Was he the reason for this horrific pattern? Or was he just another piece of the puzzle? I needed to talk to him. That evening, I waited. Mr. Grayson always left his apartment at 7 p.m. sharp to buy groceries, like clockwork. Sure enough, as the minutes crawled past 7, I heard his door creak open. I peered through my peephole, watching as his frail figure shuffled toward the elevator, a grocery bag clutched in one hand. This was my chance. The moment he disappeared, I stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding. I looked both ways, no one around. I hurried to his door. Locked. Of course. But I had come prepared. Pulling a small pin from my pocket, I inserted it into the keyhole. My hands were shaking as I worked, trying to recall the lockpicking tutorials I had watched on YouTube. I knew this was wrong. Breaking into someone's home wasn't exactly legal. But I wasn't doing this for fun. I needed to know. After a few tense moments, I heard a soft click. The door creaked open. I swallowed hard, stepping inside. Mr. Grayson's apartment was unsettling. It wasn't filthy, but it had the eerie stillness of a place untouched by time. The air was thick with dust, the curtains drawn so tightly that barely any light seeped through. The only real illumination came from it. The clock. It hung on the far wall, exactly where I had seen it through the window. Its face glowed faintly in the dimness, casting a sickly light across the room. I hesitated, half expecting it to react to my presence. But it just kept ticking. Backward. I took a shaky breath and forced myself to look away, scanning the rest of the apartment. Piles of old newspapers were stacked in the corners. A heavy wooden desk sat against the wall, cluttered with papers, books, and something that made my blood turn to ice. An old notebook. The pages were yellowed with age, the edges curled. But the names written inside, I recognized them. The man who had died last night. The woman who had fallen down the stairs a decade ago. The young tenant who had been found drowned in his bathtub despite never having a history of seizures. Name after name, death after death. All of them listed, each with a date next to them. The dates matched the exact time of their deaths. And then, I saw it. My name, scrawled in trembling handwriting at the bottom of the list. No. I staggered back, my pulse roaring in my ears. My name, with a date next to it. A date that hadn't happened yet. My stomach lurched. I turned to the clock. I hadn't noticed before, but now that I was looking directly at it, I saw something horrifying. The second hand. It was moving faster. It wasn't counting down in a slow, steady rhythm anymore. It was speeding up, as if it knew I was here. A door slammed. I nearly screamed. Mr. Grayson. He was back. I had no time to think. I dove behind the couch, heart hammering. I heard his footsteps shuffle inside, then a sharp intake of breath. He knew. He knew someone had been in here. For a terrifying moment, there was silence. Then, the sound of something scraping against the floor. A chair. Then, his weary voice. I told you to stay away. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to control my breathing. Maybe he would leave the room. Maybe I could slip out when he wasn't looking. I know you're here. I bit my lip hard enough to draw blood. There was another pause, then a slow sigh. You think I want this? Mr. Grayson's voice was barely above a whisper. You think I asked for it? I didn't dare move. I didn't make that clock, he continued. I inherited it, just like the poor bastard before me. And before him. He sounded exhausted. This thing, it chooses someone. Always someone in this building. I could hear him shifting, his voice thick with something almost like regret. I didn't want you to find out. I was trying to protect you. My mind raced. Protect me? From what? I wanted to scream, to run, to smash that damn clock into pieces. But then, Mr. Grayson said something that made my blood turn to ice. The only way to break the curse is to pass it on. I felt cold, too cold. My fingers curled into the carpet beneath me, my breath caught in my throat. What if I don't? I heard myself whisper. A pause. Then, in a voice that was barely audible. Then you die. The ticking of the clock grew louder. I clenched my fists. I had to get out of here. Before it was too late. I had to get out. Mr. Grayson's words rattled around in my skull, clashing with the deafening tick, tick, tick of the cursed clock. My body screamed at me to move, to bolt for the door before it was too late, but fear had locked my limbs in place. The only way to break the curse is to pass it on. His voice echoed in my head like a death sentence. If he was telling the truth, then I was already marked. My name was in that notebook, and the clock was ticking backward toward my death. I sucked in a sharp breath, forcing my trembling hands to steady. I couldn't let him know I was still in here. Not yet. From my hiding place behind the couch, I listened. Mr. Grayson let out a slow, exhausted sigh, the sound of his chair creaking as he sat down. He muttered something under his breath, words I couldn't quite make out, before the unmistakable sound of a cabinet opening and a glass bottle being placed on the table. Then, the clinking of ice. A drink. I barely allowed myself to exhale. Good. Maybe he was settling in for the night. Maybe I could still slip out unnoticed. But then, how long are you going to stay crouched back there? My blood ran cold. I felt like a child caught sneaking out of bed. Every nerve in my body told me to run, but my legs refused to move. My breathing hitched, my mind scrambling for an excuse, an explanation, anything. Then, Mr. Grayson sighed again, heavier this time. Come on out, he said, his voice weary, not angry. I'm too damn old to chase you. I hesitated. This could be a trap, but if he really wanted to hurt me, wouldn't he have already done it? Slowly, cautiously, I peeked over the edge of the couch. Mr. Grayson was sitting in his worn-out armchair, a tumbler of amber liquid in his wrinkled hand. His gaze met mine, tired but expectant. He didn't look surprised to see me, just resigned, like he had been expecting this all along. I swallowed hard and stood up. "How did you know?" I asked, my voice hoarse. He took a slow sip of his drink before answering. "You all do the same thing," he murmured. "You move in. You notice something's off. You get curious. And then you stick your nose where it doesn't belong." He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Every damn time." I frowned. "Every time." He set his glass down, rubbing his temple like he had the worst headache in the world. "You're not the first," he said, "and you won't be the last." I opened my mouth to speak, but he cut me off. "And before you ask, no, you can't destroy it." He motioned toward the clock with a bitter smirk. "Go ahead. Smash it. Burn it. Hell, throw it out the damn window. See what happens." I glanced at the clock. The second hand was still ticking backward. Slowly, relentlessly. "Has anyone ever tried?" I asked. A dry chuckle. "Oh, plenty." I shuddered. "And?" He leaned forward, his expression darkening. "You ever heard of a curse that just goes away? No kid. If you destroy the clock, the curse just finds another way to keep ticking." I felt sick. "So you're saying there's no way to stop it?" My voice was barely above a whisper. He met my gaze, his eyes unreadable. "There's one way," he said. "The way I told you. You pass it on." I clenched my fists. No, I wasn't going to do that. I wasn't going to let someone else take my place. "There has to be another way," I said, desperation creeping into my voice. "There has to be. You think I want to be here?" His sudden outburst made me flinch. His face twisted with something between anger and grief. "You think I chose this?" Silence filled the room. For the first time I saw it. The exhaustion in his face. The deep, hollow sorrow buried in his eyes. This wasn't just a burden to him. It was a prison. Slowly, his expression softened. He shook his head, looking down at his hands. "You don't get it yet," he murmured. "But you will." A heavy pause. Then he looked at me, really looked at me. "How much time do you have left?" My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head toward the clock. The second hand was moving faster now. A cold, sinking feeling spread through my chest. I had no idea how long I had. A day, a week, a month. I needed to leave. Now, I turned to the door. My hands fumbled with the handle, but before I could pull it open, Mr. Grayson's voice stopped me in my tracks. "If you leave now," he said, "it'll only get worse." I didn't care. I yanked the door open and bolted. I barely made it back to my apartment before collapsing against the door, gasping for breath. My heart was racing, my mind a mess of tangled thoughts. I looked around, expecting, what? That the clock had followed me? That my walls would start ticking? No, everything was normal. My apartment was mine, but I wasn't safe. I glanced at my phone, fingers trembling as I pulled up the Notes app. I needed to figure this out. Things I know. 1. The clock counts down to death. 2. Destroying it doesn't work. 3. Mr. Grayson is trapped in this curse. 4. The only way out is to pass it on. I gritted my teeth. That last one, I refused to accept it. I wouldn't let someone else suffer just to save myself. I had to find another way. I reached for my laptop, my hands still shaking as I typed every possible variation of keywords. Cursed clocks, countdown to death, supernatural timepieces, anything that might give me a clue. page after page of nonsense. Then, an old forum thread. I clicked on it. The title made my stomach drop. The clock that knows when you will die. Has anyone broken the curse? I swallowed hard and started reading. The first few posts were filled with speculation, ghost stories, and urban legends. But then, buried deep in the thread, a reply from an anonymous user. You can't stop it, but there is a loophole. You just have to be willing to pay the price. A loophole? I scrolled further, searching for more information, but the post ended there. No follow-up, no explanation. I ran a search on the username. Nothing. It was like they had vanished. A chill ran down my spine. A loophole. Could that be the key? Could I break the curse without passing it on? I had no choice. I had to find out. Before the clock struck 0, the words on the screen burned into my mind. You can't stop it, but there is a loophole. You just have to be willing to pay the price. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, heart pounding. I needed to find out more. What loophole? What price? But no matter how many times I refreshed the page, searched for the username, or scoured the forum archives, I found nothing else. It was like the person had disappeared. Or worse, I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the creeping dread slithering up my spine. A cold bead of sweat trickled down my temple as I turned to the cursed clock. Its hands were still ticking backward, and my name was still in that notebook. I had no idea how much time I had left. I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to get them. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I waited. I sat on my couch, staring at the apartment door across the hall, Mr. Grayson's door, watching, waiting for any sign that he was awake, that I could go back in there and force him to tell me the truth. The hallway light flickered. My body tensed. Then soft, deliberate footsteps. Mr. Grayson was leaving his apartment. I moved fast. The second I heard the door click shut behind him, I was already out the door, rushing across the hallway before my brain could register what a terrible idea this was. I had no plan, no weapon, no idea what I was looking for, but I was running out of time. My fingers trembled as I reached for the doorknob, fully expecting it to be locked. It turned. I exhaled sharply and pushed the door open. The apartment was dark. The stale scent of whiskey and dust clung to the air, mixing with something else, something rotten, like old wood left to decay. I stepped inside, careful not to make a sound. The living room was exactly as I remembered. The same tattered furniture, the same stained carpet, the same tick, tick, tick. The clock. Even in the darkness, I could see its face illuminated faintly by the dim light filtering through the blinds. The hands still moved backward, but something was different. The numbers. They were lower than before. My stomach twisted. How much time had passed since I last checked? How much time did I have left? I forced myself to move. The desk. That was where he kept the notebook. The names. I hurried across the room, my heart hammering as I yanked open drawers, shuffled through stacks of old newspapers and yellowed documents. Nothing. Where was it? Then, my fingers brushed against something cold. Metal. A small, rusted key. I grabbed it, scanning the room frantically. Then I saw it. A locked cabinet in the corner of the room. Without hesitation, I ran to it, shoved the key into the lock, and twisted. The door creaked open, revealing a collection of old journals, their covers worn and cracked with age. I reached for the top one. My breath caught in my throat. Names, dates, times. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, as if written in a rush. Some names had been crossed out. Others were circled. And then, I saw my name. My fingers tightened around the page. The time next to my name was dangerously low. A lump formed in my throat as my eyes flickered to the next entry. A name I didn't recognize, but the time next to it was even lower. Someone else was going to die before me. I stared at the page, my heart pounding. Did Mr. Grayson know this person? Did he try to warn them? Or was he just waiting, letting fate play out like it always did? I had to find out. I grabbed my phone and snapped a quick picture of the page before shoving the journal back into the cabinet. Then I froze. The apartment door creaked. A shadow moved outside the frosted glass window. Mr. Grayson was back. I barely had time to react before the door swung open. His silhouette stood in the doorway, motionless, silent. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, his eyes dropped to the open cabinet. And I knew. He knew. A slow exhale left his lips. "I told you not to do this," he murmured. I took a step back. My pulse was a wild drumbeat against my ribs. "I need to know the truth," I said. Mr. Grayson studied me for a long moment. Then, with a tired sigh, he stepped inside and shut the door behind him. "You don't want the truth," he muttered. "You want a way out." I swallowed hard. "Is there a way out?" A flicker of something, pity, crossed his face. "Maybe," he admitted, "but you're not gonna like it." My mouth went dry. "The loophole," I said. "What is it?" He hesitated. Then slowly, he moved past me, walking toward the cursed clock. His fingers traced its worn edges, his expression unreadable. "You can break the cycle," he murmured. "But the only way to do that is to take the place of the person who's next." My stomach dropped. I took a shaky step forward. "What?" He turned to face me. "If you want to stop it," he said, voice low, "you have to let the clock count you down first. Before the next person. Before the next name in the book." I stared at him, horrified. "That's the loophole," I whispered. His gaze was steady. "It's the only way to reset it. To stop it from moving forward, for a while at least." I shook my head. "That's not a loophole. That's just dying faster." "Maybe," he admitted. "But it's the only way to break free without passing it on to someone else." The room spun around me. I thought of the name in the book. The person who was next. Could I really do this? Could I really take their place? Or was there still another way? My eyes flickered back to the cursed clock. Its hands kept ticking. Backward. Toward zero. Toward death. And time was running out. The room felt suffocating. The air was thick with dust, the scent of something old and rotting clinging to every surface. But none of it compared to the weight of Mr. Grayson's words. "If you want to stop it, you have to let the clock count you down first." I couldn't breathe. I took a step back, my body screaming at me to run, to get out of this apartment, to pretend I had never seen that cursed clock. But the reality was unavoidable. I had already been marked. My name was in that book, and the time next to it was running out. "How long do I have?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Mr. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temples like a man who had carried this burden for far too long. He gestured toward the clock. "That depends," he muttered. "Could be days. Could be hours. But if the next person on the list dies first..." He trailed off. He didn't need to finish his sentence. I already knew what he meant. If the next person on the list died, then my countdown would move faster. My fate would be sealed. I clenched my fists. "No," I said, shaking my head. "There has to be another way. There has to be a way to break this curse." Mr. Grayson let out a humorless chuckle. "You think I haven't tried? You think I haven't searched for a way out?" His voice turned bitter. "I've had this curse for years, kid. And let me tell you, the only choices you have are to accept your fate or pass it on to someone else." The weight of his words settled in my chest. Pass it on to someone else. The thought sent a shudder down my spine. Could I really do that? Could I really condemn another person to this nightmare, just to save myself? I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. My gaze flickered back to the journal in my hands. The name after mine, the next person set to die, was unfamiliar. I didn't know them, but they were out there, living their life, unaware that the clock was already counting down for them. I swallowed hard. Who is this? I asked, pointing to the name. Mr. Grayson sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Some woman down the street, he muttered. A schoolteacher, I think. Lives alone. Nice lady. A schoolteacher. Nice lady. I felt sick. It would be so easy to let fate take its course. To let the clock do what it always did. If she died, I would have more time. More time to figure something out. More time to live. But that meant her life would end. Because of me. I clenched my jaw. No, I won't just sit here and let this happen. Mr. Grayson sighed, shaking his head. You still don't get it, do you? You don't get to choose. The clock doesn't care about what you want. It doesn't care about who deserves to live or die. It just is. He leaned forward, voice low and steady. The only reason I've survived this long is because I was willing to do what needed to be done. I passed the curse on. A cold chill ran down my spine. You mean you let someone else take your place? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes told me everything. You're a coward, I spat. Mr. Grayson chuckled darkly. Maybe, but I'm still alive. He leaned back, crossing his arms. And if you want to stay alive, you better start thinking like me. I turned away, my stomach twisting with disgust. No, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't let another innocent person die because of this damn clock. I had to find another way. But how? My eyes fell on the clock again. It was old, wooden, with intricate carvings along its frame. It looked delicate. What if I destroyed it? The idea hit me like a lightning bolt. If the clock was the thing keeping this curse alive, then maybe breaking it would end everything. Maybe it would stop the countdown, stop the deaths, stop the cycle altogether. It was worth a try. I spun around, grabbing the nearest heavy object, a paperweight from Mr. Grayson's desk. And before he could stop me, I hurled it straight at the clock. The impact was deafening. Glass shattered. Wood splintered. The clock toppled off the shelf, hitting the ground with a sickening crunch. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, no! Mr. Grayson's scream was raw, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Anger? Desperation? He scrambled toward the broken remains, his hands trembling as he tried to piece the shattered fragments back together. You idiot, he hissed, his face pale. You don't know what you've done. I stepped back, breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I ended it, I said. The curse is broken. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew something was wrong. The air in the room changed. It felt heavy, charged with something unseen, something dark. And then, tick, my blood ran cold. The sound didn't come from the broken clock on the floor. It came from behind me. I turned slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. There, hanging on the wall, where the first clock had been, was another clock. Identical, pristine, whole, and its hands were still moving. Backward. No, I whispered. That's impossible. Mr. Grayson let out a hollow laugh. You really thought it would be that easy, he muttered. The clock can't be destroyed. It won't be destroyed. I staggered backward, my mind racing. Then what the hell am I supposed to do? Mr. Grayson stood slowly, brushing the dust from his clothes. His expression was unreadable. You have one last choice, he said. Let the next person die, or take their place. I shook my head. No, there has to be another way. There isn't, he said flatly. And if you waste too much time trying to find one, you'll be the next one to go. No delays. No second chances. I clenched my fists, my chest tight with panic. This wasn't fair. I didn't ask for this. But the clock didn't care. It kept ticking, and I was running out of time. I stood frozen, my mind scrambling for a solution. Any solution that didn't involve condemning someone else to death. But no matter how hard I tried to think of a way out, the truth was inescapable. The clock was still ticking. Its hands moved backward in steady, deliberate motions. It was counting down, and I was running out of time. Mr. Grayson watched me, his face unreadable. "You're wasting what little time you have left," he said. "You need to make a decision." I clenched my fists. No, I refused to just accept this. "You don't have a choice," he said, shaking his head. "You either let the next person on the list die, or you take their place." I turned away from him, my stomach churning. There had to be another way. Destroying the clock hadn't worked. Smashing it had only made it come back stronger. But maybe I wasn't thinking about it the right way. Maybe I wasn't supposed to destroy it. Maybe I was supposed to change it. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think logically. What did I know? The clock counted down to a person's death. It had existed for years, maybe even longer than Mr. Grayson had owned it. And it always moved backward, never forward, never stopping. What if I could reverse it? I turned to Mr. Grayson, my heart pounding. "Has anyone ever tried making the clock go forward?" He blinked, taken aback by the question. "What?" "You heard me," I said, stepping closer. "You told me that the clock can't be destroyed, that it always comes back. But has anyone ever tried making it go forward instead of backward?" Mr. Grayson hesitated. That was all the confirmation I needed. "You never tried, did you?" I pressed. His jaw clenched. "It's impossible." "Is it?" I challenged. "Or did you just never think to try?" Something flickered in his eyes, doubt. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a sliver of hope. I had to act fast. I rushed toward the clock, ignoring Mr. Grayson's protests, and grabbed the wooden frame. Up close, I could see the details carved into it. Intricate symbols that looked ancient, like something out of a forgotten language. The second hand ticked backward, steady and unrelenting. I reached out and tried to push it forward. Nothing happened. I gritted my teeth and tried again, this time using both hands to twist the small dial at the back. The resistance was immediate, like the clock knew what I was trying to do. "Stop," Mr. Grayson shouted. "You don't know what you're messing with." I ignored him. I dug my fingers into the metal dial and forced it forward. The clock groaned. The wooden frame shuddered in my grip. Then, the ticking stopped. For the first time since I had discovered the cursed thing, the relentless ticking ceased. Silence filled the room. A cold chill ran down my spine. Had I done it? Had I actually? Tick. A single, slow tick echoed through the apartment. But this time, the hand moved forward. My breath caught in my throat. It worked. The clock had never been stopped before. But now it was ticking forward. I turned to Mr. Grayson, my chest heaving. "It's working," I said. "The countdown is going the other way." But instead of looking relieved, he looked terrified. "You don't know what you've done," he murmured. His face had gone pale, his hands trembling. "You should have left it alone." A pit formed in my stomach. Before I could ask what he meant, the temperature in the room plummeted. A sudden gust of wind rushed past me, despite all the windows being closed. The air grew thick, heavy, suffocating. The clock was still ticking forward, but something else was happening. I could feel it. Something in the room had changed. Mr. Grayson stumbled backward, his eyes wide with fear. "Oh God," he whispered. "It's waking up." I turned back to the clock, and then I saw it. The numbers on the face had shifted. The countdown had vanished. Instead, something else had appeared. A name. My name. And under it, a new countdown. Only this time, it wasn't counting down to a person's death. It was counting down to something else. "Turn it back," Mr. Grayson screamed. "Turn it back before it's too late." Panic surged through me. I scrambled to grab the dial again, twisting it backward, trying to make it reverse. But it wouldn't budge. The clock refused to go back. And then, the air in the room shifted again. It wasn't just cold anymore. It was suffocating, like something else was in the room with us. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for this moment. My heart pounded in my chest. The clock kept ticking forward, its pace increasing, the numbers on its face changing so fast I could barely register them. Mr. Grayson fell to his knees, his face contorted with something between terror and resignation. "You shouldn't have done this," he whispered. I took a step back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, growing longer, reaching for me. Something was coming. Something that had been trapped for who knows how long. And I had just set it free. The final tick echoed in the room. And then, the clock stopped. The air went still, and the darkness swallowed me whole. Darkness engulfed me. Not just the absence of light, but a complete, suffocating void. A blackness so thick it felt alive, pressing against my skin, filling my lungs, clawing at the edges of my mind. I tried to move, but my body was paralyzed. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, rapid and uneven. Then I heard it. A whisper. Not in my ears, but inside my head. "You turned it forward." The voice slithered through my thoughts like smoke, curling around my consciousness. It was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. Just there. I tried to speak, but no sound came out. The voice chuckled, deep and guttural. "You have freed me." My blood ran cold. Somewhere in the blackness, a light flickered. Dim at first, then growing brighter, revealing the twisted shapes of shadows shifting in unnatural ways. I saw Mr. Grayson on the floor, his face frozen in horror. His eyes were wide, his mouth open in a silent scream. He wasn't moving. I forced myself to my feet, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The clock was still there, suspended in the darkness, glowing with an eerie golden light. But something was different. The hands were no longer ticking. They had stopped completely. The countdown beneath my name had vanished. Instead, there were 3 words. "Time is up." A cold dread settled deep in my bones. The whispering voice returned, closer this time. "You thought you could change the rules? Foolish." The shadows around me twisted, solidifying into something with shape, something humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its body stretching unnaturally in the dim light. Its face was an empty void, except for a mouth grinning impossibly wide. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. The clock was never meant to go forward, it hissed. It was meant to count down to me. Realization hit me like a freight train. The deaths, the warnings, the ticking. It had all been leading to this moment. The clock wasn't predicting deaths. It was a barrier, a seal keeping something locked away. And I had broken it. A low, rattling laugh echoed around me as the creature stepped forward, its elongated fingers twitching. "You turned the clock forward and set me free." The air crackled with an unseen energy. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The darkness thickened, curling around my limbs like tendrils. I couldn't escape. I had invited it in. The creature loomed over me, its presence suffocating, pressing down on my very existence. Its grin stretched wider. Then, a tick, not from the glowing clock, but from behind me. I barely had time to turn before I saw it. Another clock, not the same one, but similar, hanging on the wall of my apartment. Bigger, older, and ticking backward. The creature's grin faltered. Its body twitched as if in pain. The new clock's hands spun rapidly, the numbers blurring as they reversed. The air grew heavy, buzzing with unseen power. I could feel something shifting, time itself warping, bending. And then, a blinding flash. Everything shattered. I gasped awake, my body drenched in sweat. I was in my apartment. I blinked, disoriented. The clock on my wall was still there, but different. The glowing numbers were gone. The frame was old, dusty, as if it had been there for decades. I slowly sat up, my head pounding. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? I turned to my right and froze. Mr. Grayson's apartment door was wide open. A terrible feeling crept up my spine as I stood and stepped into the hallway. Inside, the apartment was eerily silent. I found him slumped in his chair, eyes closed, his breathing shallow. His skin was pale, almost translucent. The man looked like he had aged 50 years overnight. And on the wall behind him, the old clock. The hands were ticking backward again. A new name was on it. Mr. Grayson. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. The countdown was nearly at 0. Tick, tick, tick. A final tick. And then silence. Mr. Grayson exhaled one last, shuddering breath. His body went still. The clock on the wall stopped. I staggered backward, my hands shaking. It was over, wasn't it? I turned back toward my apartment, my pulse hammering. But as I stepped inside, my stomach dropped. Hanging on my wall was another clock. Identical, ancient, ticking backward. My breath caught in my throat as I read the name beneath the hands. My name. The countdown had begun again. I wasn't free. I was next. And this time, there was no one left to take my place. Tick, tick, tick. The ticking has stopped. The story has been told. Now, all that remains is the quiet stillness of the night. As you lie there, breathing in the calm, let the weight of the tale fade away. The shadows on your walls are just that, shadows. The silence in your room is peaceful, not empty. And the clock by your bedside? It ticks forward as it always should. Let your thoughts drift, like ripples on a quiet lake. There is no rush, no urgency. Just the soft pull of sleep, wrapping around you like a gentle wave. Whatever lingers in the dark, whatever whispers in the night, is only a story. Nothing more. Rest now. Breathe. And if you hear a distant ticking, it's just the sound of time carrying you into dreams. Good night. Sleep well.